Welcome once again. Tonight's December 7th, and we have been looking at the Four Noble Truths. And during the last week, and the fourth Noble Truth, which is the Eightfold Path. That sequence is kind of hard to argue with. Yes, that there is suffering in the world. There's dissatisfactory nature to simply being in this human form, feeling separate, getting old, having pain, being in a relationship, and all of that. And the idea that there's a cause of that, and it has to do with not, it has to do with ego clinging. It has to do with wanting things to be a certain way, and finding that they so rarely are just the way you'd like to have them. And even if they are momentarily that way, that quickly leaves. Um, and the third noble truth that there can be an end to the suffering, and that, of course, has to do with lessening that grip of identification with that which wants and averts and uh, sees itself as separate and focuses exclusively on its own comfort. And the way to manifest that end of suffering, according to the Buddha, is here in this Eightfold Path. And just briefly reviewing, the Eightfold Path can be thought of as being in three sections. And those sections are the wisdom section, which is right view and right thinking, the sort of ethical conduct triad of right speech, right action, and right livelihood, and the mental discipline aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path, uh, right diligence, which means something very specific. We'll get to it eventually. Right mindfulness and right concentration. And last week we spoke about right view. Um, and just touching there, one of them was this from Thich Nhat Hanh, to have faith and confidence that there are people who have been able to transform their suffering. Um, we can look and actually see people have just normal human beings have actually done this using this method. Um, to be aware that the seed of awakening is present in everyone. Sometimes the hardest one to believe that about is ourselves. Sometimes the hardest one to believe that about is that guy over there who does not look for even a second like he might have a seed of Buddhahood in him. But nonetheless, there it is. Um, and some of the other things we've talked about at some length with the Lojong, the view of everything being an ongoing process that is ever changing, that is impermanence, that everything is that we see is the effect of previous causes, as cause and effect. That whenever we look out there, we're really simply seeing the effect of what happened before, and how that can take some of the personal out of how we criticize others and how we do the same about ourselves. Um, and sometimes that right view is thought of as simply really realizing the truths of suffering, the cause of suffering and the end of suffering. That seeing that is right view. Another way, a shorthand of right view, is seeing things simply as they are, rather than the way we would like to have them be, or whatever obscurations or distortions we bring to what we're looking at or experiencing. So tonight I'm going to continue to use this Thich Nhat Hanh book and move on to the second of the folds in the Eightfold Path. I like the idea of folds because you can see it sort of folding back on itself. You know, it's not like it stretches out in a line. It touches and touches and touches and touches. They aren't separate. I like that image. So this next one is right thinking. And let's hear what Thich Nhat Hanh has to say about that. When right view is solid in us, we have right thinking. We need right view at the foundation of our thinking. And if we train ourselves in right thinking, our right view will improve. Again, it kind of reminds me of the Lojong talking about, to really cultivate relative bodhicitta, the deep practice of compassion, you need to be able to touch that vast, expansive, boundless aspect. And having that, and then moving into relative bodhicitta and those practices, that helps with that touching of the boundless and vast within us. So if we train ourselves in right thinking, our right view will improve. Thinking is the speech of our mind. Right thinking makes our speech clear and beneficial. Because thinking often leads to action, right thinking is needed to take us down the path of right action. So he connects on both sides of this, of the Eightfold Path there. Right thinking reflects the way things are. And you can say that the right view allows you to see that. And right thinking reflects the way things are. Wrong thinking, what does wrong mean in this situation? It simply means that which is not beneficial, that which will not really help us relieve our suffering. Wrong thinking causes us to see in a, quote, upside down way, viparyasa. But to practice right thinking is not easy. Our mind is often thinking about one thing, while our body is doing another. Mind and body are not unified. Conscious breathing is an important link. When we concentrate on our breathing, we bring our body and mind back together and become whole again. Reflect just for a moment and see if you can bring up a time when you're really aware that your speech and your action is very different than what your mind is thinking. One that comes to my mind, which probably says more than I'd like to share about myself, is times when I might be present with someone whose points of view are very different than mine, but it's a situation where I'm being friendly and polite, but my mind is not. And when that's happening, I'm not really completely present within the context of that conversation. I'm not accepting. I'm not fully receiving what's being said. And what I am trying to communicate is going to be distorted by that imbalance. When Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, he meant that we can prove our existence by the fact that our thinking exists. He concluded that because we are thinking, we are really there existing. I would conclude the opposite. I think, therefore I am not. Um, he continues, as long as mind and body are not together, we get lost and we cannot really say that we are here. If we practice breathing mindfully and touching the healing and refreshing elements that are already within and around us, we will find peace and solidity. Mindful breathing helps us stop being preoccupied by sorrows of the past and anxieties about the future. It helps us to be in touch with life in the present moment. It's interesting how he brings mindful breathing, being aware of this present moment with the body breath, so prominently in this section on right thinking. And his next sentence kind of speaks to that a bit. He says, much of our thinking is unnecessary. Those thoughts are limited and do not carry much understanding in them. Sometimes we feel as though we have a cassette player in our head, always running, day and night, and we cannot turn it off. He also has sometimes called that radio station NST, nonstop thinking. We worry and become tense and have nightmares. When we practice mindfulness, we begin to hear the cassette tape in our mind and notice. We can notice whether our thinking is useful or not. Most of the time, we're not really aware of that continual. It's just become so much a part of what's happening as we walk through the world, this ongoing commentary, that we don't really pay it a whole lot of attention. And as we gradually do more and more of that, when we become increasingly mindful of the mind state, mindful of the mind in the mind, we begin to hear some of the things the voice in our head is saying. Um, Thinking has two parts: initial thought, vitarka, and developing thought, vichara. You don't have to remember the Sanskrit words, but or maybe they're Pali. But it's just to say that this is not Thai just speaking from his own thinking about this. This is, a part of centuries, millennia old understandings of thinking and the mind. An initial thought is something like, this afternoon I have to turn in an essay for literature class. The development of this thought might be to wonder whether we are doing the assignment correctly, whether we should read it one more time before turning it in, whether our teacher will notice if we hand it in late, and so on. Vitarka is the original thought. Vichara is the development of the original thought. And he doesn't go into this here, but we've talked about this before, that original thought simply arises. There it is in our mind. It's not something that we can predict or will have any control over. It's just there. And sometimes it's not as neutral as, oh, I have an assignment to hand in. It might be a thought that is full of affect, strong feelings, positive or negative, about various kinds of things. And some people have been kind of caught up in, oh, I need to stop thinking like that. And they kind of get disappointed in themselves and frustrated when such thoughts continue to arise. But it's not something that we have control over. That is a great example of, this is the causes and conditions. There is the effect that is brought about by causes and conditions, really in the subconscious, the storehouse consciousness of the mind. And there it is. It's that second part, that second thought, that we begin to have some capacity to be um, transformative with. In the first stage of meditative concentration, both kinds of thinking are present, he continues. In the second stage, neither is there. We are in deeper contact with reality, free of words and concepts. My experience continues to be that there may be stretches where thoughts don't arise, but they don't go on and on unless I'm on retreat or just heavily involved in concentrated practices. Thoughts continue to arise. It's their nature. Thoughts arise, and it's there they are, there they go. If we don't hook on to them and spend a lot of time trying to make them different than they are. We are in deeper contact with reality in this second stage of meditation, free of words and concepts. While walking in the woods with a group of children last year, I noticed one of the little girls thinking for a long time. Finally, she asked me, "Grandfather Monk, what color is that tree's bark?" "It is the color that you see," I told her. I wanted her to enter the wonderful world that was right in front of her. I did not want to add another concept. And then he says there are 4 practices related to right thinking. So here he is giving us practices that we can use if we choose to. These would be second thought practices. A first thought has arisen, and this first practice is, are you sure? That would be your second thought. This thought has arisen. It's probably perhaps opinionated. So one of the things you can say is, are you sure? If there is a rope in your path and you perceive it as a snake, fear-based thinking will follow. The more erroneous your perception, the more incorrect your thinking will be. Please write the words, "Are you sure?" he says, on a large piece of paper and hang it where you will see it often. Ask yourself this question again and again. Wrong perceptions cause incorrect thinking and unnecessary suffering. The second one is, what am I doing? I like that one because you can use various inflections. You can say, what am I doing? Or you can say, well, what am I doing? There are lots of ways of asking that question. Sometimes I ask one of my students, what are you doing? To help him release his thinking about the past or the future and return to the present moment. I ask the question to help him be right here, right now. To respond, he only needs to smile. That alone would demonstrate his true presence. Asking yourself, what am I doing, will help you overcome the habit of wanting to complete things quickly. Anybody relate to that one? I relate to that one. Like, washing this dish. Smile to yourself and say, washing this dish is the most important job in my life. When you ask, what am I doing? Reflect deeply on the question. If your thoughts are carrying you away, you need mindfulness to intervene. When you are really there, washing the dishes can be a deep and enjoyable experience. But if you wash them while thinking about other things, you're wasting your time and probably not washing the dishes well either. If you are not there, even if you wash 84,000 dishes, your work will be without merit. Emperor Wu asked Bodhidharma, founder of Zen Buddhism in China, how much merit he had earned by building temples all over the country. Bodhidharma said, none whatsoever. But if you wash one dish in mindfulness, if you build one small temple while dwelling deeply in the present moment, not wanting to be anywhere else, not caring about fame or recognition, the merit from that act will be boundless, and you will feel very happy. Ask yourself, what am I doing often? When your thinking is not carrying you away, and you do things in mindfulness, you will be happy and a resource for many others. So right thinking, he's saying here, is thinking that doesn't carry you away from things that you're actually doing. The thinking that carries us away from the things we're actually doing doesn't have to seem unpleasant or like bad thoughts. It just separates us. Third one, hello habit energy is in quotes. We tend to stick to our habits, even the ones that cause us to suffer. Workaholism is one example. In our past, our ancestors may have had to work nearly all the time to put food on the table. But today our way of working is rather compulsive and prevents us from having real contact with life. We think about our work all the time and don't even have time to breathe. We need to find moments to contemplate the cherry blossoms and drink our tea in mindfulness. Our way of acting depends on our way of thinking, and our way of thinking depends on our habit energies. When we recognize this, and that's kind of the key, to recognize when this is happening. That gets back to that mindfulness of mind. When we recognize this, we only need to say, hello, habit energy, and make good friends with our habitual patterns of thinking and acting. When we can accept these ingrained thoughts and not feel guilty about them, they will lose much of their power over us. That's a pretty big statement there. When we can accept these ingrained thoughts and not feel guilty about them. Some of these thoughts are thoughts types of thoughts we've talked about before uh, that we don't care for. Remember, we talked about exposure as one of the four forces, um, or is it five forces? Um, just reviewing the Lojong to have an aspiration or an intention, and then there's the habituation and familiarization, the exposure of saying, "Oh, look at that! How curious! Look what Ken is up to, and how unhelpful that is in the moment." And the fifth is the dedication, so that all beings are brought into that. So, small aside there. Um, so when we can accept these ingrained thoughts and not feel guilty about them, they will lose much of their power over us. Right thinking leads to right action. Um, and four, so we have, what do we have now? We have, are you sure? We have, what am I doing? We have, hello, habit energy. And we have, the fourth one is bodhicitta. We've spent a lot of time talking about bodhicitta during the last year. The awakened heart mind. Our mind of love, he says, is the deep wish to cultivate understanding in ourselves in order to bring happiness to many beings. It is the motivating force for the practice of mindful living. The desire to awaken and the desire to be of benefit. With bodhicitta at the foundation of our thinking, everything we do or say will help others be liberated. Right thinking also gives rise to right diligence. Again, we'll get about that later. But the motivating force for the practice of mindful living, bodhicitta, the foundation of our thinking. So bodhicitta can, I think we even talked about that, is certainly a part of right view, that cultivation of deep understanding and deep compassion. And then he goes on. The Buddha offered many ways to help us transform troublesome thoughts. One way, he said, is to replace an unwholesome thought with a wholesome one by changing the peg, just as a carpenter replaces a rotten peg by hammering in a new one. And he mentions what sutra that's from, back in the days when they used pegs instead of nails. And again, the wholesome and unwholesome, for anyone that's not familiar with that, has to do with, is it helpful? Is it not helpful? Will this help relieve suffering? Will it add to suffering? It doesn't have to do with an external imperative of any kind, uh, or morality as we often think about it. If we are constantly assailed by unwholesome patterns of thought, we need to learn how to change the peg and replace those patterns with wholesome thoughts. The Buddha also likened unwholesome thinking to wearing, it's a good one, to wearing a dead snake around your neck. Oof. The easiest way, he said, to keep unwholesome thoughts from arising is to live in a wholesome environment, a community that practices mindful living. With the help and presence of Dharma sisters and brothers, it is easy to sustain right thinking. Dwelling in a good environment is preventive medicine. We're not monastics, but this community is part of what can be helpful to us in that regard. Right thinking is thinking that is in accord with right view. This is his final paragraph here. It is a map that can help us find our way. But when we arrive at our destination, we need to put down the map and enter the reality fully. Think non-thinking, in quotes, is a well-known statement in Zen. When you practice right view and right thinking, you dwell deeply in the present moment where you can touch the seeds of joy, peace, and liberation, heal and transform your suffering, and be truly present for many others. Boy, there's a lot there. And my take, for whatever it's worth, is that it's important to have a cognitive understanding of all of this and to use that to practice in ways that are really helpful uh, in the process of transformation and development of compassion and touching that boundlessness and so forth. But he's saying, when you're actually there, you don't have to keep thinking about it in that way. And I think we've all been there at times when the feeling of the burden of self isn't there for a little while. And we don't have to work our way through our distortions to simply flow with something that is beautiful and helpful, either within us or between us in whatever way it arises. And that's the end of his chapter on right thinking. And that is where I will end this evening as well.